They called her worthless, not just once, not in passing. It became the soundtrack of her life, whispered at birth, muttered in anger, printed between the lines of every sideways glance. She grew up hearing it more than her own name, a mistake, a burden, a mouth to feed in a house that never had enough. Her mother died young. Her father drank older. The town she lived in had no room for softness, no patience for struggle, and certainly no tolerance for a girl who cried too much and spoke too little. She learned early that silence was safer. That looking down was better than being noticed. That some bruises don't show on skin, and those are the ones that last the longest. When she was 12, a woman from the church offered her a job sweeping floors, washing linens, cleaning after sermons. It wasn't kindness. It was ownership disguised as charity. She slept in the storage room behind the altar, curled between old pew cushions and a locked door. No one asked if she was cold. No one asked anything at all. By 16, she was working on the edge of town, scrubbing clothes in river water so cold it split her hands open. The townspeople gave her scraps, coin if they were feeling generous. One day, a man in a long coat handed her a bundle of bread and said, "God bless the useless, they teach the rest of us what not to be." She smiled and thanked him, then vomited in the grass behind the mill. The pregnancy wasn't a surprise. The shame was. The father was a merchant's son, slick with promises and quick to disappear. When her belly started to show, the whispers turned to insults. The church lady locked the door. The bakery stopped offering leftovers. A preacher grabbed her by the arm in front of the whole market and shouted, "This is what happens when you live without worth." She didn't cry. Not then. She just walked, right out of town, with no bag, no plan, no destination, just a heartbeat inside her that she wasn't sure she could protect. She walked until the sun turned her skin to ash and her legs gave out. She collapsed on a dirt path near a broken fence and waited for whatever came next. It wasn't death. It was worse. Two men found her, one tall and thin, the other round like a keg. They didn't ask her name. They didn't offer help. They saw her belly, saw her silence, saw a transaction. "She's still got value," the round one said. The tall one nodded. "Won't fetch much, but she'll work." She was sold that night, no signature, no questions, just a sack of feed, a half-dead mule, and a nod. The tall one took her, called her girl like it was a curse, made her cook, clean, fetch water, and stay quiet. When she bled, he smacked her. When she cried, he ignored her. When she spoke, he told her to hush before someone got hurt. Weeks turned into months. Her belly grew heavier. Her back ached like it carried the weight of her entire life. She tried to escape, once made it past the tree line, before he caught her and dragged her back by the hair. He left bruises on her neck that didn't fade for a month. After that, she stopped looking at the horizon. She stopped looking at anything. Until the night, she saw fire in the distance, not the angry kind, the warm kind. Flickering lights between tall trees, just beyond a ridge where the wind sounded different, softer, older. She waited until the man passed out drunk beside the fire, rifle across his lap and a bottle at his feet. She moved quiet as a whisper, stole only what she could carry, not for herself, for the child. She walked into the dark, guided by nothing but instinct and desperation. She didn't know what she was walking toward, but she knew what she was leaving behind, and that was enough. The wind felt different in the forest, not angry, not sharp, just alive like it knew her name, even if she'd forgotten it herself. She moved through the trees like a hunted animal, every crunch of leaf beneath her feet feeling too loud, every breath caught between ribs too tight to hold hope. She didn't stop to sleep. She barely stopped to breathe. The child inside her kicked once, not hard, but just enough to remind her that she wasn't alone, that even now, even after everything, she still carried life. When the sun rose again, she collapsed. Her legs gave out near a bend in the river, and her body followed. She didn't faint. She surrendered to the cold, to the hunger, to the sheer weight of surviving too long without being seen. She didn't expect to wake up, but she did. And what she saw first was sky not grey, like the town she came from, not red like the fires of that man's camp, blue, endless, clean. And then faces above her, not angry, not afraid, just watching. Women, their hair braided long, their hands gentle but firm. One of them placed something warm on her lips, another checked the swell of her belly. No one spoke, no one judged. She passed out again. The next time she woke, she was in a lodge made of hide and timber, wrapped in blankets softer than anything she'd touched in years. Smoke drifted lazily from a fire in the center. The smell of sage lingered in the air. She moved slowly, painfully, but with the awareness of safety, a feeling foreign and terrifying all at once. A man entered quietly, kneeling beside the fire. He didn't stare, didn't ask questions, just waited. When she finally whispered, "Where am I?" he looked at her and said, "Safe." It took days before she believed him, before she let herself eat fully, before she stopped flinching every time someone reached near her, but they never pushed. They let her unravel slowly, like thread from an old coat. The man's name was Wanekia. He wasn't loud, he wasn't soft. He was presence, the kind that fills a room without needing to say a word. He taught the children in the village to track prints in the dirt, to listen to the ground, to speak with truth or not at all. He didn't look at her the way other men had. He looked at her like she might still have something sacred inside. It confused her, it angered her, it terrified her, but it also kept her from running. One night she sat outside the lodge, belly round beneath the stars, and he sat beside her in silence for what felt like hours. Then, without turning, he said, "Your name is not what they gave you, not what they took. It is still inside, but buried." She didn't reply, didn't need to. The next morning, one of the elder women brought her a feather black-tipped, smooth, tied with a thin red thread. "This," she said, "was once given to me when I lost everything. Now I give it to you." She held it like glass, like fire, like it might burn her if she gripped it too tightly. She didn't know what it meant. But her hands remembered it, her body remembered it, and slowly her soul began to remember too. In the following days, she helped around the camp not because she had to, but because something inside her stirred when she did. She carried water, learned the names of roots, helped bind wounds. She spoke little, but she watched everything. And one afternoon, as she knelt beside a girl who'd sliced her hand on sharp stone, the girl looked up and asked, "Were you always brave?" She opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out, because for the first time she realized she didn't know the answer. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, she was about to find out. Bravery didn't arrive like thunder. It didn't crash into her life or explode in her chest. It crept in quiet, slow, patient, like the way fire warms stone long after the flames have died. And it showed itself not in the big moments, but in the smallest ones. Like when she spoke the names of plants aloud for the first time, or when she braided another woman's hair and didn't flinch at the closeness, or when she laughed not because she was trying to fit in, but because something inside her had finally softened enough to let sound out. There were still moments when shadows crept up behind her, when the voice of the man who sold her echoed in her mind, when shame crawled up her throat and made her hands shake. But now, when that happened, she didn't run. She walked outside, found the tallest ridge above the village, and sat with the fear until it wore itself out. Wanekia found her there once. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just sat. Eventually he said, "Pain is a stubborn teacher, but it only wins if you refuse to speak." She didn't answer then, but his words stayed with her, like a seed tucked deep beneath the soil. The more she healed, the more she noticed things. Not just about the people about herself. She noticed how her footsteps no longer shuffled, how her shoulders had begun to square, how her voice didn't always tremble when she used it, and the child inside her, it had grown strong. She could feel its rhythm now, kicking against her ribs with urgency. It reminded her of herself, silent for so long, then suddenly present, demanding to be acknowledged. There was a woman in the camp named Misu, older than the trees, it seemed, with eyes that had seen war and famine and joy and loss. Misu had taken to her in a quiet way, correcting her gently, trusting her with small tasks, nodding in approval when she got things right. One morning, as they gathered wild herbs, Misu handed her a small knife. "Not for defense," she said, "for shaping." "For shaping what?" she asked. "Wood, meat, spirit, it depends on the day." She kept the knife close after that, not out of fear, out of respect, because someone trusted her with something sharp again. That same week, a boy in the village was bitten by a snake, his leg swollen, breath shallow. Panic rippled through the camp, but she didn't freeze. She remembered what Misu taught her, remembered the scent of the root they called na'ape, bitter and strong, used to draw poison. She found it, boiled it, held the boy's hand while he drank. He lived. No one praised her. They just looked at her differently after that, not like a guest, like a sister. And that night, as she watched the stars alone by the fire, Wanekia approached. "I saw what you did." She nodded. "Why did you do it?" he asked. She didn't know how to answer. So she said the only thing that felt true. "Because I could." He smiled. Not wide, not loud, but real. "You remind me of someone," he said. "A woman who walked into fire to save a village. She wasn't tall, she wasn't strong, but she stood still when everyone else ran. That's what made her a warrior." She looked at him then, really looked, and whispered, "What happened to her?" She never left. The next morning, the children called her the Firewalker. She didn't correct them, because in some way, it felt right. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was walking into her own legend, one slow step at a time. She didn't call herself a warrior, not yet. There was too much of the old self still clinging to her bones, the girl who bowed her head too often, who apologized when she hadn't done wrong, who mistook silence for safety. But the others saw it in the way she stood taller without realizing, in the way her hands no longer shook when she held a blade, in the calm she carried when storms rolled in from the mountains. They started asking her things, not just for help, but for wisdom. And she didn't feel ready, but she answered anyway. One night, a young girl no older than 10 sat by her side near the fire and asked, "How did you know when you stopped being afraid?" She stared into the flames, then replied, "I didn't. I just got tired of letting fear speak first." The girl nodded, like that answer made all the sense in the world. That same week, the traders came. Not raiders, not slavers, just men with wagons, furs, and questions. They meant no harm, but they brought stories from the outside stories of the railroads pushing west, of settlers demanding land, of towns growing fat on greed and ignorance. They laughed when they spoke of the savage territories and said they'd heard of a woman once pale-skinned, dirty, pregnant, and wild, who disappeared after stealing from a farmhand. She froze when she heard that, because that story was hers, or at least the version the world had written for her. She stepped away from the camp that night, climbed the ridge where the trees bent toward the stars and screamed, not with her voice, but with her whole body, her fists clenched, her jaw locked. Every part of her remembered what it felt like to be dismissed, misunderstood, rewritten by someone else's hand. And when the scream was done, she knelt, not to the pain, to the truth, because she finally understood something that had eluded her for years. She didn't owe the world her silence anymore. She returned to the camp at dawn, and when Misu saw her, she only said one thing: "It's time." She was confused. Time for what? To take your name. The naming ceremony wasn't loud. There were no drums, no shouting, no declarations, just a fire, a circle, and the people who had seen her bloom. Wanekia stepped forward, with something wrapped in elk hide, the same feather she had been given, now bound to a carved medallion etched with symbols of the earth, the sky, and the body. He placed it in her hands and spoke in Lakota. She has walked through fire and carried life. She has faced ghosts and made them kneel. She is not the girl who ran. She is not the girl who hid. She is not the girl they called worthless. She is Wiaka Zintkala, brave feather. She felt the name settle on her shoulders like armor made of memory and ash. It didn't erase what came before. It crowned it, acknowledged it, transformed it. And for the first time in her life, she said her name, not the one she was given, not the one whispered behind her back, but the one she chose. I am Wiaka Zintkala. And they echoed it, one by one, until the forest itself seemed to carry it through the wind like a hymn. She wore the feather after that, not to show off, not to prove, but to remember. Every time her fingers brushed it, she was reminded of the night she stood at the edge and didn't fall. And when the children asked why she wore it, she said, "Because I am still flying." The name changed her posture, not because it gave her something new, but because it gave her permission to carry what was already there. Wiaka Zintkala, brave feather. It wasn't a title. It was a memory of pain survived, of silence outlasted, of strength discovered in the dark. She began to move through the camp differently, not louder, not faster, just rooted, present. The kind of presence that didn't need to speak to be heard, and the others responded. When decisions needed to be made, they looked to her. When conflict stirred among the younger ones, they called her to mediate. When a woman from another village arrived carrying the same haunted eyes she once wore, they asked Wiaka to sit with her, not to fix her, just to be near, because now they saw her as she truly was, and that terrified her. One night, after the fires had died and the camp lay quiet under a blanket of stars, she found Wanekia alone, sharpening a stone blade near the edge of the trees. She sat beside him without a word. He waited. Eventually, she whispered, "What if I'm not who they think I am?" He looked up. "Then show them who you are. I still hear their voices from before." "So do I," he said. That surprised her. "You?" He nodded. "I was once a boy who couldn't speak without stuttering. My uncle said I was broken. My brothers called me Shadow. For years I believed them, until one day I followed a hawk into the hills and didn't come back for 5 days. When I returned, I spoke clearly, not because I was healed, because the silence taught me how to own my words." She stared at him, the firelight flickering across his face. He added, "The voices don't go away. You just learn to drown them out with truth." She sat with that. Let it settle. Let it hurt. Let it help. The next day, she began teaching the younger girls how to weave, not just with thread, but with story. Each knot carried a lesson, each color a memory. And the girls sat in a circle, listening to her voice like it was wind carrying wisdom from somewhere ancient. She told them the truth, not just the glory. She told them about the cellar where she once hid from a man's footsteps, about the barn she gave birth in alone, about the night she nearly ended everything, and how somehow she was still here, not despite those things, because of them. It was around that time the council called her to speak, not for ceremony, for defense. Word had come from the outer ridges. A group of settlers had taken land that once belonged to the Lakota sacred ground, burial trees, waters that fed their healing roots. There was talk of confrontation, of standing firm, of holding space. They asked her what she thought. She didn't flinch. She said, "We fight, not with guns." Not with blood, but with presence, with prayer, with bodies rooted to the land like oaks that will not bend. And so they went. She among them, pregnant, tired, but unwavering. They rode for 3 days, then walked the last mile on foot in silence, heads high, voices steady. When they reached the ridge, the settlers laughed at first, called them superstitious, called her a ghost. Then she stepped forward and began to speak, not with rage, not with fear, but with the weight of a woman who had been underestimated her whole life and had no more use for pretending. She told them who she was, who the land was, what it meant, and why they would not leave. And when she was done, the wind picked up, the trees swayed, and not a single settler laughed again. They didn't leave that day, but they didn't expand either. And by the next moon, they were gone. No bloodshed. Just truth spoken. That was her first real fight, and she won. Not with violence, with story, with fire in her voice and roots in her feet. And when they returned home, Misu placed her hand on her belly and said, "Your child will never know the girl who was once called worthless. Only the mother who became a warrior. As her belly grew, so did the silence inside her, but not the kind she used to fear. This silence was full, heavy with meaning. It came in waves during the early hours of the morning, when even the wind had nothing left to say, and all she could hear was the steady rhythm of her unborn child's kicks. A heartbeat inside a heartbeat. A life that would never know the names they used to call her. A life that would never have to carry what she carried unless she chose to pass it on. And she wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. Wiyaka Zintkala wasn't just her name anymore. It was her vow. She spent her final moon before birth preparing. Not just her body, her mind, her spirit. The elders taught her old songs, rhythms of breath passed down from women who had birthed in caves, in rivers, in open fields beneath burning suns. Misu brought her herbs to calm her blood and oils to rub against her tightening skin. The other women braided her hair with feathers and cloth, symbols of wind and lineage, of struggle and softness. The men built a birthing lodge not to separate her, but to honor the threshold. Because birth, in their eyes, wasn't a medical act. It was a ceremony, a crossing, a kind of death that made room for new life. Wanakia was never far. He didn't hover, didn't press. But every time she looked around, he was there splitting wood, preparing meals, speaking to the elders with the kind of quiet reverence that made her feel like maybe this wasn't just about her. Maybe he felt this life too. Maybe he had been walking beside her long before either of them noticed. Then, on a night when the moon hung low like a drum above the trees, the time came. It started slowly, waves of pain that rippled through her back like thunder rolling across the plains. She didn't cry out. Not because it didn't hurt, it did, but because she had made peace with pain a long time ago. They were familiar now, companions in some way. The women gathered around her, hands ready, prayers low and steady. Someone placed her old feather near her heart, and when the final push came, when her body split wide with agony and fire, she felt something ancient leave her. Not just the child, something else, something older than her suffering. She screamed, not in fear, in triumph, and then silence again, until the cry, that first piercing, undeniable cry of a soul arriving in the world with no shame, no fear, no doubt. A girl. They placed her on her chest, and for a moment the world stopped spinning. She wasn't broken. She wasn't ruined. She was reborn. The women sang, the fire hissed, and outside the lodge, the wind howled like it was celebrating. She named the child Taku Skuye, meaning what is sacred, because that's what she'd always been, even when they didn't see it, even when she didn't see it herself. And as she cradled her daughter in shaking arms, she whispered stories into her ear, not fairy tales, not myths, truths, of girls called worthless, of fires survived. of feathers that carried names strong enough to split the sky. And her daughter listened, eyes wide, mouth soft, body curled into hers, like she already knew the story, like she'd heard it in the womb and had been waiting all this time just to arrive in the right chapter. Later that week, the community gathered under the cedar trees. The naming was small but sacred. Wanakia stood beside her, holding the ceremonial blanket. The elders nodded. Misu wept openly. And when they asked her what name she would give her daughter, she said it clear, steady, proud, Takuskuye, because no one will ever question her worth again. That night, she stood alone at the river, watched the moon reflect off the surface like a mirror, and saw herself not the girl from before, not even the woman they honored now, but something beyond words, a story that didn't need to be believed to be true. She touched the feather against her chest and smiled. Spring settled in with a softness she hadn't known in years, not just in the air or the thawing of the river, but in her body, her movements slower, more intentional, her thoughts no longer spinning with shame or fear. She had crossed something no map could chart. She had become something no one back in that old town would recognize. And that was the point. Every morning she carried Takuskuye wrapped to her chest, close to her heartbeat. The child hardly cried. She was watchful, still, wide-eyed like the moon that had greeted her first. The other women called her Star Eyes. The elders said she would grow into a leader. Wiaka Zinkala didn't argue. Her daughter had already changed everything without saying a word. She spent her days passing on what she had gathered, not just the stories or the healing roots or the songs, but the silence, the strength in it, the kind that holds space, that listens, that makes others feel safe enough to speak. She helped build a new lodge near the West Ridge for travelers who might come broken the way she once did. A place with no questions asked, where fire was always burning and water always warm. It became known as the House of Return, because not everyone who found it had been lost. Some were just trying to remember how to come back to themselves. Wanekia would come by, sometimes with herbs, sometimes with meat, sometimes with nothing but a glance. Their connection was no longer spoken about, not because it wasn't real, but because it didn't need to be explained. They had already walked through the fire together. What came next didn't require titles. One evening, as they sat watching the children run barefoot through the tall grass, she asked him softly, "Do you think I was meant to end up here?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "No," he said. "I think the path that tried to destroy you brought you here by accident. But you stayed on purpose." She nodded, and that was enough. Years passed. Not all smooth. There were storms, droughts, illnesses. Not everything stayed the way it was. But one thing never changed: her name, her place, her fire. Visitors from other tribes began to speak of the woman with the feather and the voice that made men sit down and listen. Some came expecting a warrior with armor. Instead, they found a mother, a weaver, a healer who looked them in the eye and made them remember something about themselves they thought was gone. Wiaka Zintkala never called herself a leader, but when she walked, people followed. When she spoke, people remembered, and when girls with haunted eyes showed up at the edge of the camp, she didn't ask where they came from. She just took their hand and said, "You are not worthless. You are just waiting to be seen."